Welcome to Public Safety Talk Radio, the podcast for all of our heroes of public safety, including law enforcement professionals, firefighters, EMTs, corrections officers, healthcare workers, and more. The show is produced by the POCUA and is founded upon its Soundness initiative. This episode is also sponsored by the POCUA, a consortium of financial institutions serving law enforcement, as well as other first responders and public safety professionals. Always remember, if you aren't banking with a POCUA credit union, you're just working with an institution that just so happens to serve public safety professionals, and you deserve better. Hi, I'm Ken Bader, your host for Public Safety Talk Radio, and it's Friday afternoon. I know that this is going live on a Tuesday, but it's Friday afternoon, and it's the end of Friday, and I have a great guest that was willing to be with me at the last point of Friday, and her name is Katie Nelson. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She is the social media and public relations coordinator for the Mountain View Police Department in Northern California. She specializes in social media management, speaking across the country on social media best practices, crisis communications, and forming positive working relationships between law enforcement and the media. And God knows we need that today. She's also the co-host of her own podcast, which is the Silicon Valley Beat. And we're going to talk about that. But Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's awesome to have you. Like I said before I even pressed the record button, it's always so nice to have a fellow podcaster because there's no questions. Well, what if this happens? You know, what if I do this? Like, no. It's like, yeah, just press the record button. We'll see what happens.
Exactly.
So that's awesome. So I've got to ask, I've seen tons of public relations professionals at different law enforcement organizations, but you're one of the first that I've seen with a title that says social media and public relations coordinator, obviously for the Mountain View Police Department. And you've been doing that since 2015. Before you came on board, was there a social media portion to that title, or did you kind of add it to that traditional PR role when you got there?
No, actually, that was part of the title when I applied. So
Awesome.
The department actually it was one of the first in the country to start using social media to connect with their community members. I mean, we're in the heart of Silicon Valley. If we're not using tech to every possible advantage that we can, what are we even doing? So my boss, actually, who's now the deputy chief here, he started our social media channels back in I want to say 2012. And it's just evolved from there, and God bless him, he's let me kind of take them and run with them. So I've been having a blast for the last 5 years. I like to say my job is the ultimate millennials job. So I'm really enjoying myself.
Awesome. Yeah, you came on time, as we talked about, actually early, and you had a smile on your face right from the very minute. So you have to be enjoying something.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, how can you not be happy on a Friday afternoon?
Exactly. Well, I'm really pleased to hear, and in all honesty, there are a lot of police departments that I'm seeing that are having roles similar to yours, which I think is spot on. How are we going to connect with the community, especially in the days of COVID-19 and so forth, if we're not on social media, if we're not using that medium to be able to connect with people. It's so far removed from the days of some of the police organizations I remember, where their idea of technology was getting a new string for those two metal cans that they had stretched, between, two precincts.
Hey, we had those too. Don't knock them till you try them.
Yeah, but I always I think I'm older than you, and those things never worked. You had to pull them, really, really tight, and you never really heard anything. But anyhow, I'm dating myself. So for those that don't know, what is your typical day? What is kind of the role Monday through Friday, and probably Saturday and Sunday for that matter, for a social media and PR expert for the police?
Well, that's, I think, the beauty of this job is that there's no typical day. Everything is atypical. I'm lucky if I start work at 8 o'clock in the morning. But what I love about this job is that yes, it doesn't stop, but that's because our community knows we're here. And so if somebody has a question at, whatever time, I'm able to jump on to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Nextdoor, wherever they happen to be, and have these conversations with them, and they don't have to wait. They get answers in real time. And so on an average day, we're starting in the morning straight up with having conversation. And that is much of what the day consists of, is conversation with community members, with media representatives, with other people in other parts of the country looking for help or assistance. It really is just the best of mixed bags. And in between all of the traditional public information officer work that I get to do, like I said, I get to spend my days on social media. I get to help create campaigns around education, and I get to really do what I love, which is having meaningful moments with people who I may not right now at least get to meet face to face, but they know that they're getting some kind of help right off the bat by just reaching out to us and asking us, for assistance.
Yeah, I could see that. And since you are a media expert, I hadn't planned on asking you this, but I want to tap into that area of expertise, because I see in some areas of the country, police departments and the media don't necessarily have the best relations, unfortunately. Sometimes, I'll blame the media, sometimes I'll blame police, and sometimes I'll blame both parties. But I know that part of the traditional thinking is we don't need to talk to the media. We're in an investigation, we have things going on. You'll be the last to know. And the problem with that, I found, is that the media, if they don't get the factual narrative, or at least enough to go out there and report, to say bluntly, they will make up a narrative which fits into their newscast, which isn't always positive for police. So from that standpoint, how does your role really help to build a relationship with the media, to be able to say, all right, here's part of the story. Yeah, I want to give you more information, but we really can't for these obvious reasons. How does that help with the local media?
It certainly, I have come to understand, especially in the last couple of years, that silence is an answer, or saying no comment is an answer. And that's probably the most damning and most damaging thing any agency can say to a journalist. I used to be a journalist. And so the court of public opinion is very strong. And if a law enforcement agency is not providing information in a timely fashion to their community, which often includes their own reporters, the gaps are being filled by the rumor mill. And so it does you no good to have this adversarial relationship with journalists. And half that battle is just forming relationships before the crisis happens. So I am a big believer in coffee meetings. I know that that's not necessarily what we can do right now in the age of COVID, but any way that you can just check in with your local media market, the journalists that are in there, and just keeping up conversations, that's a huge asset to you, because at the end of the day, they are going to help you amplify your message, especially in a time of need. So being able to have good working relationships with them is pivotal to anybody's success. And I can speak on that both as now in a law enforcement role, but also beforehand when I was a journalist. I can't tell you how important being able to have strong relationships with PIOs and with police departments were to make my job more effective and actually do my job well.
Yeah. So I have to ask too. I would be remiss if I didn't. How did you even get into this? I mean, you weren't a cop chasing down bad guys. You were a successful journalist. You earned awards, I see here, and then you wound up working for the police department. How does that happen?
It all happened over coffee, actually. I'm not joking. It's like a main food group. I thought my first job out of college, I was at a very small paper, but a very lovely paper out in the Central Valley in wine country. And I had no interest in.
Terrible.
I know, right? I had no interest in being any kind of scanner chaser, anything like that. I wanted nothing to do with covering cops in courts. And one day the reporter who was actually covering that beat left, and my editor pulled me and he said, "Oh, by the way, you're our new Cops and Courts reporter." And that day, it was just, I had a life-changing experience involving law enforcement. I went on my first ride-along shortly thereafter, and I was just like, what am I doing? Like, I'm so in the wrong line of work. Like, I love this so much. Yeah. Flash forward 6 years later, and I was actually having a meeting with the woman who was in my role prior to me. And we were walking back from coffee at a little place down in our downtown here in Mountain View. And she turned to me and she goes, "Would you ever want this job?" And I thought she was kidding. And I started laughing. I said, "Yeah, sure. Why not?" And then 4 months later, she gives me a call while I'm on vacation. She said, "Hey, I'm leaving. Do you seriously want to try this job out?" And I was like, "Oh, okay. You were serious." And met with my boss. And within 15 minutes, I think we realized that we were finishing each other's sentences. So it was just like a match made in heaven. And I finally got to fall into, by all these random circumstances, a position at a police department that I count my blessings every day.
Now a word from our sponsor, the Police Officers Credit Union Association. The POCUA can suggest a credit union that serves public safety professionals in practically every state in the country. One state we definitely have covered is California. The Police Credit Union serves all law enforcement personnel and their civilian coworkers, including volunteers within California employed by any municipal, county, state, or federal agency or special district. They also serve firefighters, EMTs, and court employees in 9 counties within the state. The Police Credit Union has proudly been serving first responders since 1953. For more information about the Police Credit Union, go to thepolicecu.org or call 800-222-1391. To find an institution to serve you in any of the other 49 states, go to policecreditunions.com. And always remember, if you aren't banking with a POCUA credit union, you're just working with an institution that just so happens to serve public safety professionals. And you deserve better. I would think, too, that you would have a very unique perspective when there is kind of a rough story out there, where you can understand the angle from law enforcement and also understand, well, all right, this person has a deadline. This person, does need something. Let's find a middle ground here.
Yeah, and I love being able to, still have a hand. It's like you still have a hand in journalism. You're just another part of the story.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's so much fun. I don't think I've ever come to work a single day and gone, today's been kind of boring. Like, I always come in and I'm like, all right, let's do this. This is great.
Well, speaking of fun, you're also a podcast host. You host, as I mentioned, the Silicon Valley Beat. And I had the name of your co-host partner, who's a police captain. Yeah, my notes, Saul Yeager. Did I get that right?
Jaeger, yes, Saul Jaeger.
You never know. You always think that, okay, I should pronounce this like a Y, and then you go there and you actually do have to say the J. What's up with that?
You're not the first and you're not the last. You'd have to ask him. I don't know. He's got all sorts of funky pronunciations for things.
So both you and Paul host the Silicon Valley Beat. From what I understand, it was relaunched March of 2019. At least that's what I saw on Stitcher and Apple Podcasts and all that. First off, why a podcast? There aren't too many police departments that are doing that. Why
True.
A podcast in the first place?
I think we were looking at other ways to connect with our audiences. It was like, okay, are we getting stale and boring by just doing social media? We had kind of a start and stop podcast for several years, and it wasn't done with such regularity that it was sticking particularly. Yeah. And this was right around the time that, like, I was really getting into Serial, My Favorite Murder, Small Town Murder. I mean, clearly I have a thing for a particular type of genre. And
as the true crime category director for Podcast Magazine, I wouldn't understand that at all.
Well, yeah, so I was listening to stuff and I was like, we could do it like this if we wanted to. And we realized though that we wanted to start by kind of inviting people in and really giving them this very pulled back look and hearing from people within the department just what it's all about. And there's a very different connectivity that happens with audio as opposed to reading or watching or whatever. It's so fundamental. It's how stories have evolved for, eons. And so we really sat down and took a serious look at how we would bring in certain topics, how we would talk about certain things, and who those people were that could help do that with us. Sometimes you've got these great topics, but you may not have great personalities to go with it. So it was very meticulous in how we built it. And our first season was just an incredible success, particularly when we started diving into the more emotional aspects of policing, especially like talking with people who have battled cancer in our department, or talking with our chaplain who just had this very just incredible podcast with us about just what it means to think and feel and be important because you're you. And these were just, we hit our stride there, and it was like, okay, we kind of get what we're doing a little bit.
Yeah, you hit on something really important there, which I actually had never thought about before. Is I've always thought about two different, two completely different ideas. One, in my work with law enforcement, we talk quite a bit about humanizing the badge. That while unfortunately there are some folks that will always be negative and anti-law enforcement, there are some that are in some kind of a gray area, and once they see you as a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, somebody that's just trying to make a living, have a career, and then go home to their family, and not just a badge or a uniform, that changes. And I think podcasting, I never thought of it this way, but I think that podcasting is one of, not the only one, but one of the perfect mediums to help to do that. And my point is I remember sitting, it was actually one of the last darn conferences I was able to go to before this little COVID thing. I went to podcast movement evolutions, I believe it was called, down here in Los Angeles. And they had, I believe it was the CEO from iHeartRadio. And he was talking about podcasts and how over the last few years, podcasting has grown so much because of the intimate nature of having it in your ears. There's something about video. There's some visceral reaction to reading something that has been written very well. But there's something about, with as I see you right now with the earbuds, of being in people's ears, that really does make a difference. And I never made those two connections before until just this very minute when you talked about, the beauty, my words, not yours, of a podcast.
Yeah. And it's so multifaceted too, right? Because you can hear tone isn't lost like the way it could be in words. And that's coming from somebody who loves to write. Yeah. But like there's the tone and the passion. You can hear it so explicitly when you're talking about things in a podcast. And podcasts don't have to be long either. You can knock out an incredible story or have an incredible conversation in a very short or a very long amount of time. And you feed into people's various attention states. And you're readily accessible when they're ready. That's the other thing. It's like, you're not telling them, hey, you got to listen right now. You're there when they're ready. And that's kind of a nice little luxury, because in law enforcement, time is not a luxury for us. And suddenly this one little facet of our ability to connect with people, it is there. And I really like that about podcasting.
Yeah. I was reminded at a event a couple of years ago. I had even already gotten into podcasting and didn't realize it until the speaker said, "Do you actually know what pod in podcast stands for?" And personal on demand. And I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. But you're right. It could be as short or as long as it needs to be. The editor and founder of Podcast Magazine says that all the time when he's asked, well, how long should my podcast be? Well, there is kind of a rule of thumb, but he always says it's as long as it needs to be.
Yep.
If you've got a 67-minute piece of really good content, then it's 67 minutes.
That's right.
Either in one episode or 2 parts or whatever you want to do it, but it's 67 minutes if you have 67 minutes of quality content.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, when we kind of dove into our first storytelling narrative arc podcast that we did after our first season of Silicon Valley Beat, that was one of the things we wrestled with. It was like, how long do we make each episode as we're telling this story that, spans 30 odd years? It was, and then when we look back on our podcast now, we're going, oh my God, what were we doing with a 44-minute podcast that could have been done in 24? Like, stop it. We should have just cut people off and been like, okay, you're talking too much. Thank you. And it's all about cadence and pacing too. That's part of the thing that you learn as you go is what keeps people intrigued and engaged. Is it the way that you're talking? Is it the story that you're talking about? Is it because they have a personal vested interest? Like you are learning as you go. And that's just, you have to be fundamentally adaptable to the changes in podcasting and how that resonates with your audience. And that's what makes it so great, because it's very much like this job. It's not typical.
What is the goofiest or craziest thing that's happened in conjunction with the Silicon Valley Beat?
There was one episode that we recorded and I was laughing throughout the entire thing that my boss was like, that can't go public. Cause I could not keep it together. And it was like the stupidest joke. And for whatever reason, I lost it for about 25 minutes, and we tried to, we recorded it, we powered through, but my deputy chief was like, that can't go live. Like, that's not,
at least not like that.
No. But we've just had, especially when we were recording our narrative arc for our Cold Case podcast, you learn real quick if you have problems with speech. I can't tell you how many times we had to do take after take, because even though the sentence was so simple, we would mess it up. And when you're 2.5 hours into trying to record a single paragraph, that is exhausting. And you walk out of there and you are so drained. I think that was one of the, maybe not goofiest, but strangest phenomena that I had ever experienced with anything in regards to like a storytelling medium.
Yeah. I've often thought that for some of the recordings that I have for some of my shows and other things that I've done for clients where I've needed to record something, that I should have saved all of those outtakes. I always delete them, but I should save all of those outtakes, because they would hear me say, so on public, son of a bitch.
Oh, we have lots of outtakes, and we sit there and we're like, wow, okay, take a chill pill.
Yeah, exactly. Editing is a wonderful thing. That's why it's very rare that I do anything live from this standpoint.
Smart cookie.
So from a podcast standpoint, I've listened to your show. It's a quality show.
Thank you.
I gave a mention of it on Podcast Magazine. Since it is such a valuable medium to connect with communities in a time where we need this more than ever, why aren't more law enforcement agencies, departments, organizations doing this?
I think probably I think there are several reasons. One could be time and resources, which can be very hard. Podcasting can either be very inexpensive or it could be very expensive, depending on the equipment that you buy. It's sometimes, the muse just doesn't strike, and you're like, well, what do we talk about? Like, for us, when we started, it was like, well, we know this stuff. And we had to come to the understanding that, but nobody else does. And that's what makes it so interesting to other people. It's for those who are listening from the outside, coming in and going, oh, I'm learning something as I'm listening to this. But I think a lot of times too, it's just finding the people who want to be able to do it and carry it forward. We've been very blessed where, we've been told, my captain and I, that, we can do this recording and these recordings, the podcast, and we can spend time on it. Granted, we're both desk bound. We're not out on patrol. So I think it would be very different if you had somebody who was trying to do a podcast, but they had, their primary function first and foremost was to be an investigator or to be on patrol. A lot of, if depending on how fast your city moves, you may not just have the luxury of time to be able to sit down and do something like this. And you've got stuff happening after work too. So I think it's a bunch of factors that probably play into it. Now, that being said, the value in podcasting is incredible. I think LAPD does a great job. Granted, I know they have an entire media unit, Josh Rubenstein and
Correct.
Matthew Reyes down there. They're both, they both work on that and they do a phenomenal job. And I mean, Josh was built for radio. There's the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, I think, Katie Grant, who runs the podcast out there. She does a phenomenal job too. It's, it's getting picked up in places you wouldn't necessarily expect a podcast to be. But as I think more people try it and more people see that there are examples out there that they could at least look to for guidance before they perhaps start, I think that's all to the good, because again, it's just one more way. There is never going to be enough ways for you to connect with your community. And it is one more way to invite people in, to get those conversations going and to really get those connections made. Because if you're not doing that now, you're probably being left out of the narrative. And the worst possible thing that any law enforcement agency can do right now is not be available.
Yeah, or in some cases, be behind the curve with this type of technology and in medium. Yeah, very, very spot on. As with any tactic, there's always a pro and a con. Can you give us a pro to having a podcast through the department and maybe a con, something that you either didn't expect or it's like, wow, okay, that didn't go exactly as planned, and you learn from that?
I think the pro has been the ability to flex creatively. That's always nice, because, even in my role, like you get routine at a certain point and you're just like, okay. And you're looking for those creative outlets, and a podcast is going to be that every time. Like, you never know what's going to happen if you're having a good conversation. You may have a topic that you start out with and suddenly you end up, 180 degrees the other way. Yeah. I think the con is trying to keep up with a schedule. That has been, for season 2, at least for us, we have sessions recorded, but then getting them out and finding the right time to do that has been difficult. So, in fact, I was just talking with Saul today. I was like, when are we getting back in the studio? Like, let's go. And by studio, I mean the room where we record. We don't have an actual studio. We're very scrappy. Yeah. But it was, it's like you get to a certain point and you're like, oh my gosh, you feel like you're running out of time to be able to record and get stuff out. So sticking to a schedule is extremely important. That can be very hard. And that's actually what I think was the issue with the start and stop of our podcast initially. And then once we got in a groove, that really helped.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you said earlier, going back to your scrappy line, podcasts, they could be as expensive or as inexpensive as you want it to be. I've actually interviewed hosts from top-rated true crime podcasts that still do the podcast in in their closet, because that's where they that's literally where they get the best recording and the best sound.
Yep, never knock a closet. It's a lot more soundproof than people give it credit for.
Exactly. So any police departments thinking about podcasting, don't think that you have to have a soundproof room. Just find a closet somewhere in your building and you can make this happen.
That's right.
So, we kind of talked about, how important it is for police departments to be a part of the narrative. Is from your experience, because you're coming at this from a couple of angles of expertise, what do you recommend for police departments on how best to engage with the public, whether it be via social media, podcast, or any other media for that matter?
I don't think anything will ever replace in-person conversations. Granted, we've mentioned it a couple of times, that little thing called COVID. That's hard right now in various parts of this country. But if you have a foothold in places where people prefer to be, and right now that very much is social media. Right now that very much is podcasts. If you have a foothold there and you're exercising and you're flexing and you're really doing your best to not only post and with content, but also to engage, when we're able to see each other again in real life, people will remember that. People will remember that you took the time to answer their question, that you took the time to follow up, that you took the time to talk about things that are going on in your community that, they may have had questions about, but they weren't sure about how to raise that either, through a call or an email, or if they were even so bold as to come to the department. But being able to be accessible and being able to be human, like you talked about, humanizing who you are, not just a uniform and a badge, but a person. And by doing that through mediums like podcasts or social media, or posting your podcast on social media, like linking out, that will move, I think, more mountains than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I agree. I'm looking forward to the days where we could actually have some face-to-face human interaction.
Right?
I appreciate this technology and how it's allowed us to connect, especially during a pandemic per se. But one of the things that I've noticed is that it's not quite as bad as the telephone, where you would say and be rude at a level on the telephone that you wouldn't be face to face. Zoom and Microsoft Teams and FaceTime and all that is a little better than the phone, but it's not quite face to face, because I can't throw a hot cup of coffee at you if you say something I don't like.
I gotta say, my pajamas are tired of being worn. My real pants would like to go back on.
Yeah, I have suits and ties that haven't been worn in, I want to say, like 8 months or something like that.
Yep. My biggest fear is I'm gonna go back to full time wearing real clothes, and my clothes aren't gonna fit, and I'm just gonna be like, oh man, it's the COVID-19.
Yeah, that'll be great for the economy, at least for for all of those clothing manufacturers out there.
Right.
Last question I have for you, for those folks in our audience that either want to check out the podcast, or maybe they're even interested in possibly doing something like that and want to listen to your show to kind of get some ideas for themselves. How best can they find you and the Silicon Valley Beat?
Well, we are on every major podcasting network. So we're on, if you're an Apple user, we're on Apple Podcasts. If you're an Android user, we're on Google Podcasts or Google Play. We're on Stitcher, we're on Spotify, and I believe we're on YouTube as well. So wherever we firmly believe in accessibility and being able to ensure that people can get us where they prefer. We're not trying to tell you where to go. So just look us up, Silicon Valley Beat, Mountain View Police Department, and we'll be there.
Yeah, I think I even found you on Overcast, which is
well,
yeah,
my job here is done.
believe it or not, I think there's like 15 different podcast platforms out there.
It never ceases to amaze me where somebody's like, "Oh, I heard you on this," and I'm like, is that real? Like, I hadn't heard of that before.
Is that even a thing? I mean, now even I think Spotify is like the number one, if you could believe that. Even took over Apple Podcasts. Yeah.
My favorite thing ever is when I was at home and I tried it out and I was like, "Hey Google, play Silicon Valley Beat," and it popped up and I was just like, "Oh, It's there. It's real.
This isn't a dream. We actually
No.
did this. Well, that's awesome. Yeah, everybody in the audience, if you haven't listened to Silicon Valley Beat, even if you're not in California, if you're in, New Hampshire or someplace, give it a listen. It's a great podcast. And Katie, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me on a Friday. Go home.
I'm already home. See, while my studio is not in a closet, it is in my home. So all I have to do is walk that way, and I could be in my living room real easily. But proof that podcasting doesn't have to be expensive.
That's right. It can happen anywhere.
Anyhow, thank you again, Katie. You were a wonderful guest. And thank you to all of you who have either watched or listen to this episode of Public Safety Talk Radio, and we'll be back with you next week with another great episode. Take care. Public Safety Talk Radio is produced by the POCUA. POCUA is a consortium of financial institutions serving law enforcement as well as other first responders and public safety professionals. To learn more about our association and to find one of our credit unions or service providers near you, go to www.policecreditunions.com. And always remember, if you aren't working with one of our POCUA credit unions, you're just banking with an institution that just so happens to serve first responders. As a public safety professional, you and your family deserve better. Find a POCUA credit union today.